Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight, specifically the survivors of the Tools of Torment chapter, the siblings Talita and Renato Lyra. The Tools of Torment chapter has finally arrived, and with it plenty of discussion about the new killer that sometimes remained respectful and constructive, and sometimes really hasn't. But one thing that's gone really overlooked by pretty much everyone in the community is the pair of original survivors who also arrived in that chapter. Yeah, a pair of original survivors. You heard that right. For the first time ever, we've got two survivors in the same original chapter. This is unprecedented and exciting. It stokes some questions about why these characters both had to come together, and why every other original survivor has come alone. When I first heard that the two survivors were coming together, I was originally thinking of giving them both separate videos, because typically I allocate one video per character. But after reading the story, I thought better of it because these stories are absolutely at their best when consumed together. Much like how I covered both of the All Kill Tome stories at the same time, getting a good perspective on any one character requires you to read both stories. It's like listening to a song in stereo. Sure, it's audible in mono, once you started to play it in both ears at once, it never sounds quite the same again. But what is actually going on in their story? Let me give you a quick summary. Talita and Renato Lyra were born in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil's sprawling capital city. Contrary to popular belief, they're not actually twins. Talita is the older one of the two, and despite the fact that they clearly spent a lot of time together as children, they led very separate and distinct childhoods that were driven by their outlooks on the world. Talita had always been a crowd pleaser, idolising her tour guide mother and record label manager father for their abilities to bring people together, and seeking to build a sense of community for herself. Renato, on the other hand, sees his interactions with other people as less of a community exercise and more of a scientific observation. He had difficulty with normal socialising that may indicate a level of neurodivergency. Maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but Renato seems like an ideal character to add to my list of scrunklies on the autistic spectrum, but that's kind of immaterial to this discussion, so I'm just going to leave it to you to think on. Regardless, Renato had issues socialising that resulted in his parents taking a keener interest in making sure he was developing properly, unlike some DBD parents I could mention. When they were teenagers, Talita would work at her uncle Inacio's kite shop over the summer, and their parents sent Renato to join her to hopefully get him socialising like she was. But after Talita's bossiness caused a head-on collision with Renato's stubbornness, Inacio would teach him to settle our differences by kite fighting. I've seen people asking about this, and if you didn't know, kite fighting is a real game played by people all around the world. Even if you've never done it yourself, you might be familiar with its practice in Afghanistan if you've read or watched Kal Hosseini's The Kite Runner. The premise is that you rig up a kite with string lined with glass or metal and attempt to cut your opponent's string before they can cut yours. And this sport enraptured both of the Lyra siblings, especially Renato, who took to it like a duck to water. The pair would teach the children who came to the store the ways of kite fighting, and Talita would even film their kite fights and post them online as publicity for the store. But before long, Talita was picked up by a modelling agency who saw these videos, and she noticed with it a golden opportunity to reach a far bigger audience and create a community that stretched across the globe. This decision to part ways from the shop and their life of kite fighting profoundly affected both siblings. Talita realised that despite the allure fame presented to her, it wasn't all it was cracked up to be, and Renato, left to deal with the shop on his own, started to engage with the world in a new way as he volunteered at a nearby care home. This gave them the time to grow separately as people, but it was only when Talita decided to step away from modelling that the siblings reunited again in common cause, opening a kite fighting shop together called Fun Kites Rio, to reignite that spark of joy they had as teenagers fighting kites together and growing closer as brother and sister. Both contributed to the shop's success in their own ways. Talita used her money from modelling to get the business started, and her fame and influence on a publicity drive for the shop, while Renato used his analytical and planning skills to organise the shop and Talita's advertising campaign during those first few hectic months. And when Fun Kites Rio's first tournament rolled around, they both realised they got different things out of it too. Talita had finally found the community she'd been seeking all her life, while Renato found the same joy in knowing he'd contributed to the well-being of others that he'd found working at the care home. These siblings who were at each other's throats as teenagers had come back together in spectacular fashion to become greater than the sum of their parts, and the Fun Kites Rio inaugural kite fighting tournament was a testament to their successes. So at the end of a long and successful day, they decided to re-indulge in what first set them on this path, the humble sparring of kite fighting. But as they reeled out their lines for one last bout, they saw something else in the sky with them. It looked kind of like a drone. A wordless agreement saw them scrapping not with each other, but to see who could take it down first. And when Talita took it down, Renato ran into the forest to get it out for her. But alongside the ruined kite and drone, Renato found a man, screaming and covered in blood as a figure in high-tech hunting gear advanced on him. Who'd have thought it? It's Little Miss Controversy herself, Adriana Imai, the Skull Merchant. And she's not interested in leaving witnesses. As the siblings ran for their lives, they found themselves not on the beach, but somewhere far darker, far colder and more unfamiliar, with their pursuer hot on their heels as a dark fog coiled around them. And that's how the entity claimed Talita and Renato Lyra for its own. If I had to use a word to describe the interlinked stories of Talita and Renato, I would say they were meticulously made. Like, if you genuinely believe this chapter was rushed out, or believe the tinfoil hat theory that Tools was a salvaged Predator chapter,
shut up, just shut up, shut up, shut up, shut it up.
I challenge you to maintain those beliefs after reading Talita and Renato's stories, because there's no way these stories could possibly have been made quickly or carelessly. These two stories fit together beautifully, like two pieces of a puzzle that give you the idea of the picture viewed individually, but only give you a full perspective of it when both are in alignment. To give you a sense of what I mean here, I want to start by breaking the two down individually, and we'll start with Talita and then move on to Renato. Okay, let's go. In her story alone, Talita feels a lot like many other DBD survivors, and has a lot in common with characters like Jane, Yui, and Zarina. In all four of these stories, our main character is a young, proactive woman of colour with a particular dream or ambition, who struggles against the restrictions of society and proceeds to excel in their field. Jane overcomes racism and sexism to succeed in showbiz, Yui overcomes sexism in all walks of life to succeed in racing, and Zarina overcomes the implied white supremacist attack on her father and the general repression of her Lebanese background to become an acclaimed investigative journalist. Talita's story follows a very similar arc, as she fulfills her dream of establishing a community around herself and making people happy after a great deal of toil and soul-searching. Except there's one very notable difference that shifts the tone of her story and how I perceive her at the end of it. Society was never explicitly standing in the way of Talita's success. There's no obstinate figure of discrimination or whatever keeping her down that she has to struggle against to prevent her getting what she wants. The problem she has to overcome here is actually what she wants. She gets what she thinks she wants: a global platform to spread her name and community of Talita Lyra across the world as a model and potentially future actress. But after realising this isn't how she wants to live her life, she gives it up to effectively start again, and despite all the hard work it takes to rebuild both her business and her relationship with her brother, Talita ends up all the happier for it. Despite her similarities to the other celebrity survivor in the game, Jane Romero, the message of Talita's story is kind of opposite to Jane's. Jane's life is a constant struggle against forces trying to drag her down, and when she ultimately overcomes the difficulties and finds the stardom she craved, it all turns to ashes in her mouth when her personal bugbears come back in the form of her estranged mother. Jane's story tells us that no matter how hard you fight to earn and maintain your position, your dream of fame and fortune, it won't shield you from your demons, your own personal history, and when it comes back to bite you, the people who supported you when the going was good aren't to be trusted when the chips are down and you really need them. Talita, on the other hand, tells a much more optimistic story. Talita gets the fame she wanted just like Jane did, and just like Jane, didn't entirely find satisfaction in it. But Talita's supportive family becomes a foil to Jane's destructive mother. The same family bonds that dragged Jane down when her mother came on her show buoyed Talita in her darkest hours, when all her senses of connection and community had been severed and she needed guidance, a way out, and a fresh start. It's a much more positive take on family and fame than Jane's story, and in a world that can be as unremittingly depressing as Dead by Daylight, it's a real breath of fresh air to have a story where characters are building each other up and growing as people from that community, instead of drowning in an ocean of misery, uncertainty, and personal tragedy. It does mean the story lacks the political bite of Yui's or Zarina's, but it more than makes up for it in the refreshing clarity of its message. But there's one notable absence from this section of the video, not lost in my flowery language or devilishly charming voice: Renato. Like, I haven't mentioned Renato's name in about a page of script now, and you'd think that with the two sibling stories being so closely connected, that he'd have come up in some meaningful capacity, right? Well, there's kind of a reason I haven't brought him up as part of Talita's story. That's because he kind of isn't in it very much. Talita's story is unambiguously about Talita. Pretty much every decision is hers, and we're only given a view of her own thoughts and actions. Renato is absolutely a background player, in comparison, without much more of a presence in the story than her uncle Ignacio. Talita's story feels like it could be the kind of story a solo survivor could have come with, where her brother is an important part of her backstory, but she's still ultimately the star of the show. Reminds me of Haddie in a way. Her brother Jordan is a very important part of her personal story, but it's still her story, and she came into the fog without him. Tools of Torment could easily have been a chapter with just one survivor, and it would have been fine. Nothing crazy, just fine. But Talita's story starts to really shine when we see a retelling of those events from her brother's perspective. Renato's story doesn't have the smooth sailing of Talita's, and while Talita features in his story far more than he does in hers, the view his story presents of her is quite different. While Talita is sociable, outgoing, and already has driven in what she wants to do from a young age, Renato spends a lot more of his time just figuring things out, and if anything, develops a lot more than his sister does over the course of his story. He starts off trying to figure out how the outside world works through observation, viewing the world and its inhabitants like a scientist trying to understand something's purpose or function. This obsession with watching instead of doing alienates him from his peers and sets him apart from his far more proactive sister. And it's that naturally reactive temperament that kind of leaves him listless when Talita moves on from the kite shop and he needs to find something to occupy his time. At Talita's prompting, Renato takes up volunteer work at a local retirement home, and that turns out to be exactly what he needed to find his purpose in life and finally drive him to action. His attentive and observant nature lends itself well to caring about the well-being of others. After all, how can you help people if you don't pay enough attention to figure out what they really want and need? Given responsibility and a duty of care for the first time in his entire life, Renato comes to understand the satisfying feeling of helping others. For the rest of the story, Renato is unambiguously in his element, providing support, first emotional and then administrative, to his sister in the kite shop's early days, and doing everything he can to ensure Fun Kite's Rio's first tournament goes off without a hitch. He is transformed in temperament and purpose, and it's a really satisfying arc to see play out. It's curious to see that Talita is a pretty important part of her brother's development in his story, while he's a fairly minor part of her story, and she changes less as a character as a result. And it's what gives these characters their meat, because if these two stories were just the same in tone as well as in content, it would feel necessary to have both of them there. Just the same story told twice in the same way. And getting a view of each sibling in the other one's story kind of reflects how we as people don't have a perfect view of each person in our lives. None of us know everything about anyone we've ever met, even those closest to us, and only by living their lives, thinking their thoughts and seeing what they see, truly do we come close to understanding them and their relationships. In Talita's story, Renato is barely a consideration of much of the story's length, as Talita makes any of her own decisions and discoveries about herself. Renato is kind of an afterthought, making him seem kind of flat. While in Renato's story, Talita is presented as almost airheaded compared to Renato's practicality. She's the one leading the life of glamour, as she tries to chase her dreams, while Renato is left behind doing the grunt work and trying to figure things out on his own. These would be uncharitable, valid analyses of the characters if you'd only read one of the two stories. That's what makes reading them both so important to fully understand their relationship. The best way that I think I can put across the differences between the Lyra siblings is that Talita feels like the main character and Renato does not. Look at the ideas that are associated most closely with Talita. She's outgoing, proactive, she wants a community and an audience, as her trying to find one to join. Everything she does is in service of constructing a community around herself. This isn't presented as egotistical though. It's a desire to bring people together, and you can't really do that by just following the crowd. But be that as it may, Talita is still building the world around her, in a way that draws everyone's attention to her, and kind of pushes her brother to the side as a consequence. She feels like the main character of the story that both siblings are telling. Renato, by contrast, is way more like a supporting character, both in the figurative narrative sense in that he is less central to the story than Talita is, and also literally. He's just a very supportive guy. He's not the one putting Inaccio's kite shop out there on the internet. He's not the one who took the initiative himself to start playing his guitar at the care home. Talita had to prompt him. He's not the one chasing his dream and leaving everything behind for it because he doesn't really have a dream, at least not at the start. But the beauty of Renato's story, and why I like him a little more than Talita, is how it shows you don't have to be the main character all the time to live a fulfilling life. You don't have to be the action hero, the star with their name in lights, as long as you're happy doing what you do. And if you can make other people's lives a little bit more comfortable doing it, then that's all the better. It's a story that doesn't confuse realism for pessimism. You can't always be the hero, you can't always save the day, and some people just aren't cut out for that sort of thing. But that doesn't mean your life has any less value, that you're less of a person, or that you can't lead a rich and fulfilling life from your experiences. Renato Lyra tells you that you're okay, and that spending your days in pursuit of the good life, la dolce vita, doesn't need big systemic struggles or grand revelations of truth. It just means doing what you're good at and what you love, without hurting anyone. And this is a lesson that couldn't be told to the reader without juxtaposing his story with that of his sister. It's fantastic and leads perfectly into the story's ending when they're both together again on the same page for the first time in years. When they kite fight again on that beach, it's exactly how you might expect. Talita, always the overachiever, wins their kite fight as she takes down the drone herself, the drone itself being a symbol of its owner's youth just like their kites. Renato decides to help her by taking the kite back in, but it's the combination of Talita sticking her neck out to take the drone down and Renato being supportive, slightly against his better judgment, that brings everything crumbling down and results in their capture by Adriana and the entity. It's only when the story ends that you realise what makes Talita and Renato work as survivors. The two stories together bring something that we don't see very often in DBD, a sense of true optimism. The vision of the world presented by the Lyra siblings is a far cry from the grim and dark world presented by basically everything else in Dead by Daylight. The killers, of course, are full of cruelty, violence and grisly fates, and even most of the survivors have had it pretty rough in some capacity. But the Lyras took adversity in their stride and used it constructively to make their lives better and those of the people around them. Right up until the moment they find Adriana's hunting victim, everything has gone just fine. They've worked hard in the hunt for satisfaction, and they're finally reaping the rewards, the world paying them back for all their hard work and dedication, only for it to get swept away from under them when the entity comes to call. Until Talita and Renato arrived, I don't think we've had many original survivors since the first four, with their arrival in the fog felt like a straight up injustice to those characters. Some survivors are too investigative by half, digging up the past and walking a dangerous line without really knowing what they're letting themselves in for and finding answers they simply weren't prepared for. Others did a favour for the wrong person or trespassed in the wrong place, have other moral failings for which their fate in the trials is a kind of purgatory, or simply thrive under the pressure to the degree they're almost better suited to their life in the fog than they were to life outside of it. Some would even be dead. And to those people, the entity is kind of a dark saviour, simultaneously the horror that ruined their lives as well as the one that saved it. The Lyra siblings are not like this. They've done nothing wrong. They've got no dark secrets, inner conflicts, all-consuming obsessions or suspect past associations. They're kind and intelligent people who just want to live a good life and help others live their lives too. And that's so refreshing and heartbreaking at the same time, because all they did to end up here was be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their story for now is complete, and it leaves you with a genuine warmth towards these two young professionals that's matched only by your desire to see them freed from the entity's torments. If you're the kind of person who wrote off this chapter as a disaster or a failure, I urge you to give these survivors a look into, because they are technically fantastic. The world of optimism, cooperation and hard work being rewarded is a lovely one to pay a visit to, and Talita and Renato are brilliant guys to lead us through it. And after a chapter as stylistically dour and grim as Forged in Fog, it's a real breath of fresh air. The Lyra siblings have this irrepressible personality that makes them almost impossible to dislike, and behaviour has really gone above and beyond to maximise their charisma. They're the first original survivors to get their own lobby theme, and they even have their own voice lines when they're in the lobby together. They bring their camaraderie and positivity into the fog, and they're more than welcome additions to our cast. Tools of Torment is a divisive chapter for sure. My soft spots for it are very well documented. While I do acknowledge he's far from perfect, I happen to like the Skull Merchant, both from a gameplay and character perspective. Even if people might disagree with me on that one, I genuinely don't know where that discord could be found when it comes to Talita and Renato. I hope that everybody who found Skull Merchant's lore to be lacking in places finds what they're looking for in the new survivors, and I hope Brazilian fans who aren't pleased at a draft representation of their country got more out of Talita and Renato instead. These two are really charming characters with intelligently written story, and please, if you have the time, read up on them. Especially if your feelings on this chapter are a little frosty, I hope the stories of two siblings kite fighting on the beach can lighten your mood a little bit. After all, it certainly did to me. Well, that is everything I have to say about Talita and Renato Lyra. So now the chapter's here, what do you guys think? As people who are optimistic, do you still like it? As people who are a bit more negative, have you warmed up to it a little bit, or is it still as bad as you thought it was going to be? Let me know in the comments, I do read an awful lot of them. And while you're down there, do feel free to subscribe if you want to keep up with my insane ramblings. As per usual, special thanks to all my beautiful patrons who make the videos like this possible and get a day's early access, with some other sweet perks as well. If you're interested in joining up, then the link is in the description. You can be part of early access gang on my Patreon. I'm gonna try and keep this one brief because I've got lots of stuff I'm working on at the moment and I really want to get around to showing you as soon as possibly can, so I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now.